Where is the care and compassion in America's welfare state? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question.
Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, as you'll see again today. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you, our viewers, and our listeners.
Yeah, I want to remind everybody of our online conference series, How Austrian Economics Impacted My Life. We've got a series of real stars in the Austrian movement. We start out with Ben Powell, professor of economics at Texas Tech. And then last week we had Mark Skousen, the organizer of Freedom Fest, an Austrian scholar. This coming Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, we've got Larry White, professor of economics at George Mason, Hayek professor there. As you all know, George Mason is probably the leading institution in terms of economics departments in the Austrian free market school. So I'm certain that Larry's going to give as entertaining a talk, an enjoyable a talk, an enlightening talk as Skousen and Powell. So I would invite you to come and join us for the live session so you can participate in the Q&A. It'll go no later than 8 p.m. at the latest. And just go to our homepage at fff.org, scroll down to upcoming events, click on conference. At the next page, click on register, and then fill out the information there, and you'll get a Zoom link, and then join us on Thursday evening at 7 with the Zoom link. All right, Richard, what I'd like to discuss with you and what I made reference to a minute ago about our principled, uncompromising perspective is the welfare state way of life under which we live. We have all been born and raised under this system. It's a system in where the government takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people through the taxing process, the Internal Revenue Service, and then distributes it through the welfare bureaucracy situation, with agencies and departments and so forth that dole out this money. And the entire rationale of this way of life is based on care and compassion, that this reflects the willing heart, the caring, the compassionate heart of the American people. You see this especially among devout Christians, where they say, oh, gosh, the welfare state shows you what Christian people we are, that the Christian principles, love thy neighbor as thyself. And so when we have programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which provide retirement pay and medical care for seniors and the poor, and then there's public housing and food stamps and welfare for corporations, that it just shows you what a good, caring, compassionate people we are. And we have challenged that notion, ever since we started FFF in 1989. That is a totally false notion that the welfare state is based on care and compassion. I mean, how can any system that's based on force, and that's what taxation is. I mean, you don't pay your taxes. We all know what happens to you. They put liens on you, attachments, garnishments. They prosecute you, they incarcerate you, they fine you. There's nothing voluntary about taxation. You either pay your taxes or they do bad things to you. How can any system based on force be considered caring and compassionate? And how can the IRS be an instrument of the caring and compassionate and willing heart of individuals, or the faceless bureaucracy of the Social Security Administration, to the Medicare Administration or Medicaid Administration, or all of these departments and agencies that dole out this money? And I think that if we're ever going to get this thing dismantled, which is what we should do, we need to dismantle this thing. We need to make the case that this is a totally false notion that is based on care and compassion. I hold that care and compassion can only come from the willing heart of an individual. That is, that when people donate to others or donate to a church or to an organization that helps out people, that's genuine care and compassion. Like when a parent gets sick and children come to the assistance of that parent or grandparent, now we're talking about genuine care and compassion. Or when a church group has a food drive or has a program that helps the poor within the jurisdiction of the church, that's care and compassion. But when the IRS agent comes and seizes a portion of your money, or when you fill out your income tax return, there is no care and compassion at all. And of course, related to this is the whole issue of individual liberty, but let's set that aside, as important as it is, for now, and just stick here with this care and compassion argument. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's nothing wrong with care and compassion. The motive, the sentiment often expressed by such people is well-intentioned, well-meaning. There's nothing wrong with having an empathy and a sympathy for the circumstances and conditions of those who are less well off than themselves, who've experienced a tragedy or misfortune or an accident not of their own causing or making. Just bad times, unfortunate times. The question is two levels, an ethical one and a practical one. The ethical one is the one that you've been touching upon, Jacob. And that is what can be ethical about a philosophy or an attitude or a sentiment of compassion that compels people to do the right thing, even if they themselves don't want to do it or don't believe that the way you're going about it is the correct way. There is no ethical act unless an individual has had the ability to choose between doing A instead of B. It's like at Christmas time, and you're walking along the street during your holiday shopping, and you see the fellow dressed up as Santa Claus ringing the bell, collecting money for the Salvation Army. You can either put a few pennies or a few dollars into the bucket that he has there, or you can walk by. What would make it an ethical act if someone saw you about to pass by our Santa, ringing his bell and saying, help the poor, the needy at the Christmas time, and just as you're about to pass by, some guy grabs you by the collar, pulls you back, and says, you better put $5 in his little bucket or there's going to be consequences, hell to pay. I mean, what makes that an ethical act? It doesn't. And in fact, how can you generate, foster, cultivate a notion of a moral sense in people when they have not come to it through both seeing it in others, learning about it in their family environment, and then exercising these acts of choice themselves to see the value, the importance of having these senses of caring about others properly understood, of benevolence towards others properly understood, then being compelled to do so. I would argue that when you make someone give to charity, it results in a callousness, an insensitivity, a lack of empathy and sympathy. If someone says, but look at the poor there, it's not my business. I paid my taxes. It's the bureaucrat's concern, not mine. It's disconnected from you. Whereas if others are not going to do it by force, and charitable work, philanthropic work, community, church outreach work of the type we're talking about, if it's not taken on by individuals themselves, it won't be done. And then people who have fallen upon circumstances not of their own making may very well be in hard times if not for that help. Now, that sounds, sort of, when you present that case, particularly to progressives, leftists, the American sense of liberals and so on, they sneer at you, their eyes roll. Oh, how can we rely upon private charity? People are selfish, they don't care. But the fact is, you and I have various settings talked about a good part of the 19th century, when it was certainly not an ideal place. It wasn't a utopia, but it was a century in which, particularly in countries like Britain and the United States, came closest to a classical liberal or libertarian ideal of individual liberty, freedom of choice, freedom of association, free competitive market interaction, rule of law with limited government, securing liberty, not violating them. And that century, both in Great Britain and the United States, where these principles were more or less practiced to the greatest extent in our modern historical times, was a century of the greatest amount of charity and outreach. Many of the great charities that we take for granted today began in Britain or the United States through people having a sense of undertaking these good works on their own, often by a religious calling. My Christian faith calls me to do this, or my sense of conscience as another human being compels me in the psychological sense to try to help others. And as a consequence, Great Britain and the United States were covered with charitable organizations, charity hospitals, charity orphanages, charity schools, charity self-help organizations that would assist people, giving them a meal because they've fallen upon some hard times, helping to train them, educate them, give them skills to be self-supporting. And this dotted the land. I've mentioned this before, and I'm going to mention again. In volume 2 of his famous book, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, who spent quite a while traveling around the United States of the 1830s, drew attention to his French and other European readers of the amazing quality of the American, that whenever there seems to be a social problem or a sense of helping a fellow man or advancing some good cause, almost immediately an individual calls upon others to form an association, an organization, an institutional structure, all voluntary, all private, having nothing to do with the government. And they just blossom, where it's a community, it's a region, a state. And remember, we're talking about the 1830s. He said people would come from other parts of the country to form and organize and operate these activities for education, for charity, for religious causes, for the spreading of people having Bibles, to help people who have fallen upon unemployment, or orphanages for the child who has been abandoned, whose parents have been killed. All of these types of good works emerged at this time without government compulsion, without government nudging, without sort of attempting to give people an incentive through a charitable deduction on income tax, because there was no income tax. And that was the century of good works, precisely because the burden fell upon individuals. The other aspect, and so people on the left and others, conservatives too, who have no historical memory of this, say, we have to have a minimal welfare state. People won't do it, but they did, and to an immense degree, that made the British and the Americans in particular, though not alone, obviously, among the most charitable, caring, and generous people in the world, out of their own pocket. But if I could just continue with this for another minute or two, Jacob, there's the other element, is that how do you know what is the most effective way to help the poor, the needy, those who have fallen upon hard times and misfortunate circumstances? With the government, it ends up being one size fits all. They tax us, and they impose their monopoly solution to these problems. This is the kind of housing that we're going to give to the poor. This is the kind of education we're going to give to the poor. This is the kind of food we're going to give to the poor through food stamps and other means. This. And it's all one size fits all, managed by an impersonal and hierarchical bureaucracy with no incentives or motivations or opportunities to objectively and reasonably judge, is this the best method chosen? Are the ends declared publicly achieving the goals set? Are the means the appropriate ones? The advantage of the private avenue is the following. First, people don't have to give. But precisely because they don't have to give, the advocate and the organizer of such charitable organizations has to demonstrate to the potential donor, supporter, that this is a good cause that would be deserving of their help, and that the means that have been chosen are ones that are believed to be to be most efficacious, most effective, most productive in alleviating the problem for which this purpose is being directed. And you have to show that it's right, because as you've mentioned before, I for 5 years was the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, a free market educational organization founded by Leonard Read. And I had to demonstrate to donors of fee that this is why it was advantageous to support this educational activity. This is what we're planning to do. This is the goals and targets and outreach we're hoping and planning to reach. And I know there are many other organizations and uses for your own money, but we think that this educational activity in terms of the ideas of freedom are important. We hope you will join us in making it possible. Well, we had donors, we had supporters, but you know what? It's the next year, and you need their generosity again. And you can't count upon it. You don't have an IRS to collect it. You have to go back to those supporters and say, this is how we tried to wisely, effectively, efficiently, and productively use the money that you very kindly gave. And these are the outcomes that we had. We reached these kind of people with these kind of programs, with these type of results, as we've tried to have some type of benchmarks of judging, evaluating, and comparing. And you have to do that over and over again in competition with other similar organizations or different charities and organizations totally of other sorts. And you have to demonstrate that by purpose, result, and demonstration and persuasiveness that this is the good, right cause and the best methods to achieve them, as opposed to a bureaucracy that gets funded by the state, with salaries paid by the state, with no such independent, voluntary, and competitive market testing of results, purpose, or relative success compared to other organizations with similar or related or different goals. And it's that failure to practically have an avenue to judge, are we helping the poor in the right way? Are this the best message to methods to assist them? Are we lifting them out to be self-supporting? Are we making them excessively dependent, in this case on private charity, that is not the purpose of its goal, but to make self-supporting, self-independent, self-responsible individuals? And in comparison to other organizations that say they have similar or related goals, but have chosen different means, it's the competition of the marketplace. And that's what the private sector provides in charity, in philanthropy, in good works, as much as supplying shoes, hats, and bananas. And as a practical matter, if you want to have the best means of satisfying these desirable, benevolent goals, the voluntarism of the market is far superior. And it is, as you correctly started, the more ethical one, by not imposing good works on people, but calling their conscience to see that it might be the right thing for them to do. In the October issue of the Foundation's magazine, Future of Freedom, I have an article called Albert J. Nock on Doing the Right Thing versus Government. And that was the point that Nock was making in an article written almost 100 years ago, that when the government controls things, people don't have the latitude and liberty to be guided by a moral sense of doing the right thing. If you want people to do the right thing, including charity and philanthropy and so on, you have to give them the latitude and liberty to have the chance and the motive and the benevolent calling to do the right thing. Otherwise, you create a society in which all of those desirable human characteristics are numbed and then destroyed.
All right. Well, you've raised a lot of excellent points about this area. You talked about the Salvation Army guy at Christmas, and let me amplify on that point by bringing up another example. Let's assume that I go to an ATM and I see somebody there withdrawing money from the ATM, and I take a Glock handgun and go over there and say, withdraw everything out of your ATM and give it to me. And the person says, I don't want to do that. And I say, tough luck. You either give me your money or you're dead. And so the guy says, okay, here's the money. And I go and take that money into the poorest section of town, and I distribute it to the poor, the really desperate poor, the ones that are on the verge of starvation or that need medical care. I don't use any of the money for it myself. I think even the most ardent supporter of the welfare state way of life would not claim that I'm operating in a caring and compassionate way. They would see me as a robber. They would, I think, undoubtedly support my criminal prosecution. Why? Well, because I didn't use my own money, and I didn't go ask that guy at the ATM, would you please give me your money so I can go give it to the poor? I robbed him of it. I threatened the use of force. However, as soon as I go to the state legislature or the city council and I say, go over there to that person at the ATM and impose a tax of $5,000, and they do that, and that person pays the tax, and all the money is then used to help the poor, everything changes for the advocate of the welfare state. Oh, now, Jacob, you're a caring and compassionate person because you've gone to the city council and got this money for the poor. And the taxpayer is good and caring and compassionate, even though he's given up his money because he's afraid of what the tax revenue is going to do, the revenuer is going to do to him, the government. The city council or the state legislature or the Congress is caring and compassionate. They can't see it, Richard. They can't see it. They have a blind spot when it comes to democracy. The democracy is essentially nationalizing people's income and then deciding what to do with the money. Now, you brought up the 19th century, which I totally agree with you. That it was not a utopia. There was slavery. There was other exceptions to freedom. But if you look at the late 1800s, late 19th century, this was a period of time that was remarkable for the poor. And this brings up your notion is what's the best way to help the poor? Well, the poor were flooding into America from impoverished lands where they were dying of starvation. They were coming to a land where there was no Social Security, no Medicare, no food stamps, no welfare, nothing. And why were they doing that? Because they had a chance to accumulate wealth. They had a chance to get wealthy, and a lot of them were getting wealthy. But at least they were sustaining their own lives. They were independent. I mean, what better way to help a poor person than to give him the opportunity to become a wealthy person where he's not on the verge of starvation? And this is what a lot of welfare state advocates don't realize, that their massive welfare state confiscates so much productive capital through taxation that it really deprives the people at the bottom of the economic ladder with the ability to accumulate a nest egg and to save and to build up a higher standard of living. Not to mention all the rules and regulations like minimum wage laws and licensing laws that lock the poor out of the labor market. And then they say, oh, well, you can go on welfare. Well, when I lived in Laredo down there on the border, one of my clients, I was a lawyer, was a guy that lived in public housing. And he told me that if he made too much money, they would throw him out of the public housing project because he no longer qualified. So he had to balance it out, not to make too much money. Actually, he said he was lying. So they put him in a position of lying because he was making more money and he wasn't reporting it to him. I mean, what kind of system does that? You punish people when they're making too much money so that you lock them into poverty. It's a very dysfunctional system. Now, the other point that I wish to address that you raised is the notion that some people might not give. I mean, that's an essential aspect of freedom. If you're not free to say no, you're not free. Like when you go through the grocery store line and the cashier says, would you like to donate $5 to such and such cause? But you have a right to say yes or no. And if you say no, that's your right. That's what freedom's all about. If you don't have the right to say no, then you're not free. But what we have to do in this society is have faith that most people, given the right circumstances, will respond positively. And that's what we've lost in this country. That's what the welfare state has done. It's created this mindset of dependency, like Social Security. Oh my gosh, Jacob, if we abolish Social Security today, there'd be people dying in the streets tomorrow. That's ridiculous. Of course there wouldn't be. You've got children and grandchildren, church groups, charitable groups, foundations that would respond immediately. But that's the faith of freedom in the free market and in Christian principles that we've lost. The faith now is in the coercive apparatus of the state, of Caesar, that freedom doesn't really work. We've got to have the state take care of people. And as long as that faith in the state exists, we got ourselves a hard task here. But if we can encourage people to restore that faith in freedom, that you don't need to fear freedom, freedom really does work, that a free people who are accumulating wealth, a large number of them will respond when the need arises.
Yeah, I just sort of add a caveat to the remark that you had made about the fellow at the ATM machine. And if the fellow with the gun insisted, take out your money, and gave it to the poor, how would even sort of an advocate of the welfare state react? I think that has to be responded with a caveat, and not one, unfortunately, that bolsters your implied conclusion. Because I feel that we are in a situation today, and have been for a while, where let's think of your scenario, the fellow's at the ATM machine. The fellow shows up with the gun and says, on the screen, tell me what your balance is. And the guy puts up a balance, and let's say he has $100,000. The fellow with the gun says, I want you to take out $10,000 and give it to me. And the guy says, no, that's my hard-earned money. I'm not going to give it to you. I said, do it. I'm going to shoot you in the arm, the leg, and the stomach. Since most people would prefer not to be shot. So he pulls out the 10,000 and gives it to him. And following your example, what does the fellow do? He goes to the poorest neighborhood and he divvies out the $10,000 to help poor people have a meal. I feel that many progressives, many leftists, many politically correct types today, et cetera, would say, it was just someone who had a lot of wealth and he wasn't willing to share it. And think of the value that $10,000 gave to those really poor, and he still has his $90,000. Yes, it's unfortunate, but it was the right thing to do. That's the mindset that I fear acts as an acid on the free society.
Now, you got a point, but it's just hard for me to believe that anybody, including the most ardent leftists, would defend robbery as a means to get there. At least at a private basis.
You move in different circles than me.
Let me build on what we're talking about, though, by talking about a personal experience. And that is, I grew up in Laredo, which the Census Bureau told us in the 1950s was the poorest city in the United States. And I believe it. I mean, people were really literally living in shacks. It wasn't as poor as Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, which was on the other side of the river, which is kind of an interesting, mystifying thing when I was a kid, is that this was one huge metropolitan area separated by a river. And yet on one side of the river, there's deep, deep poverty. And on the other side, it's less poverty, but still very poor. And of course, there's an explanation for that mystery. But in Laredo, the doctor's offices, this was before Medicare and Medicaid, the doctor's offices were filled. And the doctors knew as a fact that half the patients out there in the waiting room could not pay. And some of them were from Nuevo Laredo. There was never an instance of where a doctor turned away any patient for inability to pay. And they didn't make them pay in advance. They just treated them. And even with that, sometimes people would come and give the doctor a chicken or whatever, tamales, to thank him. But notwithstanding that, the doctors were still the second wealthiest people in town, second only to the oil people, because they were still making a lot of money off people who could pay. But this was their way of giving back to society, something that they felt they needed to do. I mean, this is what real life charity is all about. And the system was working fantastic. I mean, there was absolutely no reason to have Medicare and Medicaid. And when you adopted these socialist programs, that was the beginning of the end. That was the destruction of this finest healthcare system in history. Doctors, you'll recall, Richard, they loved what they did in life. They made house calls, a lot of them. The hospital in Laredo, Mercy Hospital, was a Catholic hospital that relied on donations. And then treated people for free that couldn't afford it. This is what life is truly all about. And Medicare and Medicaid destroyed that. Doctors hate what they do in life now. They have all these convoluted associations to try to respond to the soaring healthcare costs. Nobody had major medical insurance when I was growing up. They didn't need it. Going to the doctors was like going to the grocery store. The bill that you paid the doctor was just a regular bill, like going to the grocery store. It was no big deal. Medicare and Medicaid put such a huge demand on the system that healthcare costs started soaring. People started getting major medical insurance. Today, medical costs, as we all know, can bankrupt you. None of that was going on. The only thing maybe people had insurance for was catastrophic things like cancer or something like that. But it was a system that was working. There was innovations in medical care. Look what's happening today. They ended up destroying it. So what is the answer of all too many people, and including, unfortunately, all too many libertarians? Oh, we can reform the system. We can have health savings accounts. We can have this reform. We can have that reform. Richard, when you got cancer, if you can get that cancer excised, that's what you want to do. You don't want to moderate the cancer, reform it, fix it, try to hold it. No, if the doctor can operate to remove that tumor, that's what you want. And that's what needs to be done with this entire welfare state system. We need to excise it and leave a free market, voluntary charity, limited government system in its place.
Most of the people who would hear or listen to this show are probably not old enough to remember it was the late 50s or 60s, a television show called Marcus Welby, MD, starring Robert Young, and he had a partner who was a very young actor, played James Brolin played the partner. Now, Marcus Welby had his medical practice out of his house. So half of his house was like his examination room and this, that, and the other. And patients just came to the house. And he and James Brolin, playing the young partner, he would go see patients riding his motorcycle at people's homes. And, they arranged things to help, the single mom who had the sick kid, you just took care of the kid and you worked it out. Don't worry. Now that is totally different than today. Totally different than today. The idea of going to the doctor's house for an examination or for a shot, for the doctor to make house calls, have regular rounds, not in a hospital, but to people's homes, and to be able to call them up in the middle of the night, and they'll just go there. But that's even with already government starting to encroach upon these matters, even then, there was enough of this, of a private sector of healthcare and medical treatment that television show captures a little bit of a lost world, and that's how medicine was, and it could be that, and much even better than even then, if only the government would get out of the way.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap things up. I mean, the bottom line of this is that we just need to restore faith and freedom in this country. And once people have a faith and freedom in themselves and in others too, and faith in religious principles, then that's when the support for this massive welfare state way of life will dissipate. And then that's when we get on the road back to a system of free markets, of voluntary charity, of genuine limited government. So I want to remind everybody again, we've got our Austrian conference this Thursday night, 7 p.m. Eastern. Go and register at our homepage, fff.org. If you're not subscribing to FFF Daily, I encourage you to do so. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.